Hey guys, tonight we dive into a tradition that's been both revered and ridiculed, misunderstood by outsiders and mythologized by storytellers. It's a form of beauty that startles at first glance and lingers in memory long after. Women with seemingly impossibly long necks stacked in gleaming brass coils that glint in the sun and strain the limits of the body. These are the Kayan women, often referred to as the Padaung, a small ethnic group originally from the highland regions of Myanmar. Over generations, they've carried a tradition that both defines and confines them. What began as a deeply rooted cultural practice has now become a visual shorthand for the exotic, a tourist attraction, a curiosity, a taboo. You've probably seen the image before, perhaps in a documentary, on the pages of a National Geographic spread, or more likely these days in the quick swipe of a travel influencer's feed. A woman, her shoulders sloped unnaturally, her neck elongated to the point of illusion, ring after ring stacked like a golden staircase reaching toward her jawline. Beside her, stalls of woven scarves and handmade crafts. Behind her, the lens of a stranger's camera, ready to capture something unusual. But to the Kayan women themselves, those rings mean much more than spectacle. They are tradition, protection, family, and sometimes survival. This is a story not just about aesthetics, but about endurance, about how bodies become battlegrounds for culture, politics, and profit, about how women navigate the space between pride and pressure, between the desire to preserve identity and the weight of being watched. It's the story of how a ritual passed down quietly through generations became entangled in the global web of tourism and capitalism, of how an intimate, ceremonial act turned into a marketable brand, a performance, a paradox. Let's be clear, this isn't just another episode about a bizarre custom from a faraway place. That kind of framing, the one that paints indigenous traditions as little more than curiosities to be stared at, is exactly what's helped distort the truth. The coils aren't just some weird fashion statement. They're part of a larger system of belief and identity. And they come with cost, physical, emotional, and social. For the women who wear them, the brass coils are not temporary adornments. They're permanent fixtures, often worn for decades. They press down on the collarbone, shift the structure of the shoulders, and reshape the entire upper body. The weight can reach more than 20 pounds. The impact on the spine and muscles is real. And yet, many women will tell you they feel beautiful in them, powerful, seen. Others will tell you they feel trapped, and that's the tension we'll be exploring. Who decides what beauty looks like? Who benefits when traditions become attractions? And can something so personal survive when it's constantly being packaged and sold to tourists? In this episode, we trace the story of the Kayan women from the quiet villages of Myanmar to the controlled spaces of northern Thailand's long neck villages, where visitors pay to walk through cultural exhibits that blur the line between education and exploitation. We'll explore the legends that explain the origin of the rings, from tiger spirits and protective shamans to the harsh realities of war and displacement that forced the Kayan people across borders. We'll listen to the voices of the women themselves, some proud, some critical, and many somewhere in between. Because the truth isn't simple. For some, the coils are a source of strength. For others, they're a cage. And for all of them, they are a symbol that cannot be removed without leaving a mark. This isn't a story that ends with easy answers, but it does begin with a question that's been asked, quietly and uncomfortably, for years. What does it mean when tradition becomes a tourist attraction? So let's go back to where it all began, to the mist-covered hills and bamboo homes of the Kayan people, to the village paths worn smooth by bare feet and brass rings. Let's untangle the coils, not just from the women's necks, but from the stories that have wrapped around them. Let's uncover what lies beneath. Nestled in the highlands of Southeast Asia, between the borderlands of eastern Myanmar and northern Thailand, lives a people whose customs have survived war, exile, and the slow crush of modernity. Among the many traditions carried across generations, one has made the Kayan people, specifically the Kayan Lahui subgroup, known around the world: the wearing of brass coils around the neck by women. It's a visual so striking, so unusual, that it's become a global curiosity. But before it became a tourist spectacle or a subject of cultural debate, this practice was rooted in something deeper: ritual, identity, protection, and myth. The Kayan, also known by outsiders as the Padaung, are a branch of the Red Karen ethnic group. Originally from the southeastern Shan state of Myanmar, formerly Burma, the Kayan were a minority even within their home country, living in isolated villages and practicing a mix of animist beliefs and Theravada Buddhism. Their language, Kayali, set them apart, their customs even more so. So where did it begin? Why the rings? And what made this tribe turn to such an extreme form of body modification in the first place? There's no single origin story. The most widely told legend among the Kayan people involves a warning from the village shaman. According to the tale, long ago a prophecy was made: a tiger spirit would one day descend upon the village and attack the women by clawing at their necks. To prevent this, the shaman instructed the women to begin wearing protective metal coils around their necks, which would guard against the tiger's claws. Some versions say it was a dragon, not a tiger. Others say it wasn't a spirit at all, but real attacks from jungle predators. Either way, fear and survival may have sparked a custom that would later evolve into a cultural cornerstone. Other interpretations are more symbolic. One suggests the coils were designed to make women look less attractive to slave traders and raiders who frequently prowled through the region. The brass rings distorted the natural appearance of the body, making women less likely to be taken. Ironically, what was once meant to repel attention now attracts it from the entire world. And then there's the theory that it was the exact opposite, that the coils were a mark of elite beauty, worn by daughters of tribal leaders and passed down as a sign of status. The more rings a woman wore, the more prestigious her family was. Her silhouette, with its swan-like neck and regal posture, became an ideal of femininity and pride. Her body became a visual story, winding in metal from childhood to adulthood. But all of these are just theories, some told by the Kayan themselves, others by anthropologists and travelers who tried to make sense of what they saw. What's certain is that by the early 20th century, the practice was well established. It was no longer a legend or isolated custom. It had become a rite of passage. The process began young. Typically, girls started wearing coils between the ages of 5 and 9. The first set was relatively light, just a few loops of brass, carefully wound around the neck by an elder woman, usually a mother or aunt. It wasn't painful at first, just awkward. The body learned to adapt. Over the years, new coils were added or the old set replaced with longer and heavier versions. Some women eventually wore rings that weighed over 20 pounds. But let's address a common myth. The coils don't actually make the neck longer. That would be physically impossible. The human cervical spine simply doesn't stretch like that. Instead, the weight of the rings gradually pushes down the collarbones and compresses the rib cage. This creates the illusion of an elongated neck. Over time, the shoulders slope downward and the neck appears unnaturally tall. It's not magic, it's physics and patience. Once the rings are on, they're rarely removed. Some women keep them on continuously for decades, taking them off only during medical procedures or ceremonial events. The skin beneath the coils becomes pale and sometimes bruised. Muscle atrophy sets in. In cases where the rings are removed permanently, the neck doesn't collapse as some urban legends suggest, but it does remain visibly altered, and the muscles may be too weak to support the head normally for some time. Despite the physical toll, many Kayan women describe the rings as a source of strength and identity. They aren't just adornments, they're part of who they are. To remove them is to sever a connection with heritage, family, and community. When you grow up with something as natural as breathing, you don't always see it as strange, it's just life. Still, not every woman chooses to wear them. Some reject the tradition entirely, either for health reasons or personal belief. In the past, that choice was rare and frowned upon. Today, it's more common, especially among younger generations. Outside the tribe, the reactions have been predictably polarized. Early Western explorers saw the women as giraffe girls or human oddities, often comparing them to circus performers. Photographers came, snapped pictures, and left with little context. Colonial writers added their own flavor of exoticism and superiority, describing the practice as barbaric or backward. These shallow observations stuck around far longer than they should have, shaping public perception for decades. But not all outside observers were dismissive. Some anthropologists and human rights scholars took the time to understand the tradition's meaning, speaking with the women themselves instead of just gawking at them. What they found was complexity. For some, the rings were beautiful. For others, they were a burden. For many, they were both. By the late 20th century, the Kayan tradition was under threat, not from outside scorn, but from political instability. In the 1980s and 1990s, military crackdowns in Myanmar forced many Kayan people to flee their homeland. They crossed the border into Thailand, seeking asylum. The Thai government allowed them to stay, but with strings attached. Most were placed in refugee camps or isolated cultural villages where they weren't permitted to work, travel freely, or gain citizenship. And this is where the story takes a complicated turn, because the very thing that once set the Kayan apart became their lifeline. Thai authorities and private tourism operators saw an opportunity. They began promoting the Kayan villages as tourist attractions, advertising the long-neck women as living relics. Visitors were charged entry fees, souvenirs were sold, photos were snapped, thousands per day. Suddenly, wearing the rings wasn't just a tradition, it was a job. Many women felt trapped. They were encouraged, or in some cases pressured, to continue the practice so tourists would keep coming. Some were paid wages for their participation, others received nothing beyond room and board. The line between cultural preservation and exploitation blurred. Some women leaned into it. They smiled for the cameras, posed with guests, and used their visibility to support their families. Others felt they had no choice. If they removed the rings, they lost income. If they kept them on, they became attractions. And yet, amid this uncomfortable spotlight, the Kayan have found ways to keep their story alive. Some have formed advocacy groups to educate tourists and protect their cultural heritage. Others have started businesses, sold crafts, or even become spokespeople, telling their stories on their own terms. Still, the deeper question remains, how do we define tradition when it's filtered through the lens of survival? The Kayan neck ring tradition began in the hills, surrounded by myth and ritual. It was meant to protect, to honor, to define. But over time, it's been misunderstood, commodified, and challenged. And through it all, the women who wear the coils continue to shape the narrative, not with words alone, but with every turn of the brass that wraps around their lives. Their story isn't just one of body modification, it's about what people are willing to endure to hold on to something sacred in a world that keeps trying to strip it away. To understand the meaning of the coils, you have to begin not with the woman, but with the girl. In Kayan culture, the journey into womanhood doesn't begin with a talk or a ceremony. It begins with a ring, or rather, a coil of brass carefully wrapped around the neck of a child, often no older than 5. Imagine the scene. A girl sits still, fidgeting slightly, unsure of what's coming. Around her, women gather, mother, aunts, grandmothers. The mood is calm but reverent. A family heirloom has been brought out of hiding, the first coil. It's not heavy yet. It's a starter, a symbol of both pride and belonging. It's her turn now. This moment, quiet and personal, has been repeated across generations. In the villages of the Kayan, it's as common as a child's first day of school. But what begins as a cultural initiation slowly becomes a physical transformation, one that alters the body, the self, and the course of a life. These coils, worn not just on the neck, but sometimes around the shins and forearms, are traditionally made from brass or a mix of brass and gold alloy. The first set might be just a few turns of metal. Over time, that number increases, 10 rings, 15, sometimes more. The final coil, worn continuously, can be a single piece of metal shaped into a spiral, painstakingly fitted to the curve of the girl's developing body. The fitting is delicate. The skin must be padded, the metal shaped to match the contour of her shoulders and collarbone. It's not simply slipped on, it's molded, layered, and secured. Once in place, it rarely comes off. This first step marks the beginning of her transformation. Contrary to popular belief, the coils don't actually lengthen the neck. The spine remains the same length. What the rings do over months and years is press down on the clavicle and the upper ribs, compressing the torso and creating the illusion of an elongated neck. The result is a sloping set of shoulders and a longer visual line from shoulder to jaw. It's not instantaneous. The transformation is slow, subtle, and often uncomfortable. The body adjusts gradually, adapting to the constant presence of pressure and weight. At first, it's awkward to sleep, to turn the head. But eventually the body learns. The muscles shift. The weight becomes a part of her posture, sometimes even her balance. For many girls, the early years of wearing the coil are filled with pride. In their communities, this practice is not considered a burden, but a sign of coming of age. It signals that she belongs, that she is part of something ancient and powerful. The rings become her armor, her identity. She'll be admired, especially by older women who remember their own initiation. She may even be envied, especially in villages where fewer and fewer girls are choosing to participate. In her community, she's not strange, she's beautiful. But the experience isn't universal. Not every girl embraces the rings. Some find them painful, some are scared. Some don't understand why it matters so much. And in recent years, more and more girls are saying no. Still, in many villages, particularly the ones that draw tourists, the expectation lingers. This is where the story starts to get complicated because the girl isn't just preparing to take on her culture's ideals of beauty. In some cases, she's preparing to perform. Tourism has changed everything. In Thailand, where many Kayan refugees now live in government-regulated villages, the decision to wear the rings isn't always made freely. Families under financial pressure often encourage daughters to continue the tradition to help attract visitors. Tourists pay to see the long-neck women, and the presence of girls, especially young ones, in coils increases the allure. The younger the girl, the more unique the photo, the more exotic the story. For these children, the decision to wear the rings is often less about tradition and more about economics. It's not always coercion, but it's rarely pure choice. and the lines between celebration and spectacle begin to blur. Some families see this as a continuation of their legacy, a way to keep their culture alive in a foreign land. Others see it as survival. The truth lies somewhere in between. What's certain is that these girls grow up with eyes on them, not just from their own people, but from the cameras of strangers. Every step of their transformation is watched, documented, and sold as part of a cultural experience. And that weight, like the brass on their shoulders, adds up. As the girls grow older, they must decide whether to continue adding rings. Each new coil is heavier, more restrictive. It changes how they move, how they sleep, even how they breathe. There are physical consequences: compressed ribs, weakened neck muscles, stiffness. Removing the coils after many years can be disorienting. The neck feels light, unsupported. Muscles that haven't been used in years must relearn their function. But most women who continue to wear the rings don't think about taking them off. They've adapted. The pain is no longer acute, it's normal. And for many, so is the pride. In interviews, some Kayan women describe the rings as beautiful. They say they feel more feminine, more elegant with them on. They say the rings connect them to their ancestors, to their mothers and grandmothers. One woman described them as a thread of gold that binds us through time. Others are less romantic. They acknowledge the pain, the restrictions, the toll it takes on the body. Some quietly resent the way tourists treat them, as if the coils are part of a costume. But rarely do they speak of shame, because in their culture these rings are not shameful, they're sacred. It's only outside that they become taboo. Western observers for decades have viewed the practice through a lens of judgment. Early travelers described it as grotesque, primitive, or inhumane. Photographs of long-neck women circulated through colonial postcards, anthropological journals, and even circus advertisements. The women were labeled as oddities, their bodies a curiosity to be stared at rather than understood. But few of those observers ever sat down to ask why. Why do some girls still choose to wear the rings today? Why do some mothers encourage their daughters to follow in their footsteps? The answer, again, is layered. It's about beauty, yes, but it's also about legacy, about visibility, about control over one's body in a world that keeps trying to tell these women who they should be. In some cases, it's about protest, choosing to wear the rings, especially in a time when many are turning away from the tradition, becomes a statement, a way to say, we are still here, we will not vanish. And in a strange twist, the very thing that once marked these girls as outsiders is now the thing that gives them a voice. Some young Kayan women are reclaiming the narrative. They're using social media to share their experiences, telling the story of the coils from their own perspective. They talk about the pain and the pride. They share photos, not as tourist bait, but as cultural expression. They're educating outsiders, not just posing for them. Others are choosing not to wear the rings at all. And that choice, too, is a form of power, because tradition is not static, it's not a museum piece, it's living, breathing, and changing with each generation. In the end, the coils are more than metal. They are a record of choices, some made freely, others under pressure. They are symbols of a culture that has survived war, displacement, commodification, and misunderstanding. And at the heart of it all is the girl, a child who, at 5 years old, sits still as brass is wrapped around her future. She doesn't yet know how much the world will look at her, or how heavy attention can be. But she carries it anyway, ring by ring. The journey from sacred tradition to tourist attraction didn't happen overnight. But for the Kayan people, particularly the women known for their iconic neck rings, it has been one of the most jarring and complicated transitions in modern ethnographic history. To trace how a deeply personal custom became a commodity, we need to look beyond beauty, beyond myth, and into war, politics, and borders. The Kayan have long lived in what is now the eastern part of Myanmar, previously known as Burma. Their ancestral lands spread across the highland regions of Kaya State and southern Shan State. But this peaceful, agriculture-based existence was never completely secure. Myanmar has endured more than half a century of civil conflict, military coups, ethnic persecution, and brutal crackdowns on minority groups, including the Karen, Shan, Kachin, Rohingya, and the Kayan, created a cycle of displacement that still hasn't ended. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a wave of military offensives in Kaya State forced thousands of Kayan people to flee across the border into Thailand. It wasn't a planned migration, it was survival. Families packed what they could, carried children on their backs, and crossed through thick forests and dangerous terrain to reach relative safety. But what waited for them on the other side wasn't quite sanctuary. The Thai government accepted many of the fleeing Kayan as refugees, but imposed strict limitations. Unlike traditional refugees under international protection, the Kayan were placed in designated temporary shelters or cultural villages. These were often remote, fenced-in areas where residents were not allowed to work legally, own property, or move freely. The government did not offer full refugee status or citizenship. They were safe, but stateless. And in this strange limbo, a new system emerged. One that would turn the very thing that had once distinguished the Kayan culturally, the coils, into a tourist attraction. It started small. A few curious backpackers, photographers, and local guides began visiting these settlements. They took photos, offered donations, and asked questions. Some even bought crafts. But soon, word spread. Here was a real-life village of the long neck women, a chance to witness a so-called vanishing tradition up close. Tourism operators took note. What followed was the transformation of certain Kayan villages into what some human rights groups would later describe as ethnic theme parks. The most famous of these is the village of Huai Pu Keng, located in Thailand's Mae Hong Son province, close to the Myanmar border. Others, like Ban Nai Soi and Nam Phiang Din, followed suit. These were not villages in the traditional sense. They were orchestrated spaces designed to showcase culture in a palatable, photographable way. Visitors paid entrance fees, often collected by tour companies or government intermediaries. They were guided along designated paths, stopping to view women sitting in stalls weaving scarves or making jewelry. They were encouraged to take photos, buy souvenirs, and ask questions, though often filtered through translators or prepared scripts. For the tourists, it was marketed as an authentic cultural experience. For the Kayan women, it was something far more complicated. Some adapted quickly. They realized that their appearance, once ridiculed or exoticized, was now an asset. Tourists came because of them. They smiled for the cameras, posed in traditional clothing, and sold handmade goods. The coils, once symbols of community identity, became tools of economic survival. Others, especially the younger women, felt trapped. In interviews, some described how they felt obligated to wear the rings, not because of family tradition, but because their family needed the money. Some women admitted they would have preferred to remove them, but feared the loss of income. In many cases, the women received only a fraction of the tourist revenue. Much of the money went to village administrators, tour operators, and outside stakeholders. Over time, this created a cycle. Girls were encouraged or even pressured to begin wearing coils from a young age, not to carry forward tradition, but to increase the appeal of the village. Their bodies became commodities, Their lives became part of a show. Let's be clear, not all Kayan villages operate this way. Some have resisted the tourist model entirely. Others have tried to reclaim control of their image, organizing independently and setting their own terms for cultural exchange. But the dominant narrative, that of the long neck village, still defines how most of the world encounters the Kayan people today. And that narrative is riddled with contradiction. On one hand, the tourism industry has provided Kayan refugees with income and visibility. It has helped preserve certain aspects of their culture that might have otherwise faded under pressure from assimilation. It has brought medical care, education, and global attention to their plight. On the other hand, it has commodified their identity, reduced their traditions to visual novelty, and placed enormous pressure on women and girls to perform culture for profit. Even the language used to describe them, long neck women, is a Western construct. The term is not Kayan, it centers the physical modification rather than the person. It reduces a woman to a feature. It places her body under scrutiny. Tourism also blurs the lines between consent and coercion. When your legal status prevents you from working freely, when your mobility is restricted, and when your community's only viable income comes from putting yourself on display, is that really a free choice? Human rights organizations have raised concerns for years. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, along with various NGOs, has criticized the Thai government for failing to provide the Kayan with legal refugee status and for allowing their exploitation in tourism-based settings. In 2008, controversy erupted when several Kayan women were offered resettlement in New Zealand under a UN refugee program. The Thai government reportedly blocked the applications, claiming that their departure would hurt tourism in the villages. Essentially, the women were too valuable as attractions to be allowed to leave. It was a chilling reminder of how easily bodies can become bargaining chips. Despite these issues, many Kayan women continue to participate in the tourism industry, not because they are blind to the problems, but because they are navigating survival with limited options. Some have taken ownership of their visibility, using it to advocate for refugee rights, share their stories online, or run independent businesses. Others remain quietly resentful, resigned to their role in a system they didn't choose. In some cases, women have begun removing their coils. The decision is rarely public, it's personal, often done in stages. Some cite health concerns, back and neck pain, difficulty breathing, or loss of muscle strength. Others simply want to move on. They want to wear what they like, go where they please, live outside the frame of someone else's photograph. But removing the rings comes at a cost. Physically, the body must adjust. Socially, it may mean exclusion. Economically, it could mean losing a livelihood. And so many stay in the coils, not out of devotion, but necessity. In recent years, some efforts have been made to change the system. Ethical tourism models have been proposed, allowing Kayan communities to host visitors on their own terms, offer workshops and cultural education instead of just photos, and keep a greater share of the revenue. There are also grassroots movements within the Kayan diaspora focused on reclaiming their story, shifting the spotlight from the rings to the women themselves. But change is slow, and the tourism machine is powerful. As long as there is a market for exoticism, there will be a demand for women who fit that image. The rings are no longer just tradition, they are product. And the question becomes, what happens when the tradition is no longer profitable? What happens when the world moves on? For now, the brass coils remain. Worn proudly by some, reluctantly by others. Their meaning has shifted, bent by pressure, both physical and social. They were once a symbol of protection against wild animals, according to legend. Then they became a symbol of beauty. Now they're something else entirely, a mirror that reflects how the world looks at women's bodies. how it assigns value to tradition, and how easily a sacred act can be sold at the gate for a fee. The villages of northern Thailand have become the stage, the women, the cast, the rings, their costume. And yet, beneath it all, the same question hums quietly under every smile, every photograph, every tour group. What is the cost of being seen? In the villages where the Kayan people live, where the sun slants down over wooden stilts and the days follow the rhythm of tourists coming and going, the sound of resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet removal of a coil. Sometimes it's a girl saying no before the first ring is ever wrapped. And sometimes it's the act of continuing, wearing the rings not as submission, but as choice. Resistance takes many forms, and in the world of the Kayan neck ring tradition, it doesn't always look the way you'd expect. Let's begin with the women who refuse. Not long ago, wearing the rings was considered a rite of passage. Girls started young, guided by the hands of older women who had carried the same weight before them. The coils represented more than beauty, they were heritage, identity, and pride. But now, as times change and more of the world peers in, a different kind of pride has emerged. A pride in saying, that part of my culture isn't for me. In several Kayan communities, especially among younger generations, fewer girls are choosing to wear the rings. The reasons vary. Some don't want the physical discomfort. Others dislike the attention. And many are simply pushing back against the idea that their identity should be defined by something so external, so performative. Their refusal is, in itself, a form of protest against expectations, against commodification, against the weight of tradition handed down without question. This quiet rebellion isn't always easy. In villages where tourism is the main source of income, the decision not to wear rings can feel like a betrayal of family, of community, of opportunity. Some girls are told they're letting their people down. Others are told they won't find work, or that no one will care about their story without the coils. But still, they persist. They grow up watching the tour buses pull in, watching strangers take photos of their mothers or cousins, and they choose a different path, not to abandon their culture, but to shape it for themselves. On the other side of the spectrum, there are women who still wear the rings, but not for tradition, not even for tourism, for defiance. These women have seen the way the world looks at them, like curiosities, like relics, like living props. And they choose to reclaim that gaze. They wear the rings on their terms, not to perform, but to push back, to say, you don't get to define what this means. For some, the rings have become a symbol of cultural survival. They've endured colonization, war, displacement, and commercialization. The coils are proof that something has lasted, that the Kayan people are still here. In interviews, some women describe their coils as armor, not just against the physical world, but against erasure. When everything else is stripped away, land, language, autonomy, the rings remain. It's not always easy to hold that line, especially when your image is used to sell someone else's story. But some women are flipping the script. Take, for example, the rise of Kayan creators and educators on social media. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok have given them a voice outside the confines of the tourism circuit. They post videos explaining the origins of the rings, correcting myths, sharing personal experiences. One young woman, in a video that's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times, removes her rings on camera. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. She shows the indentations on her skin, the way her neck sits slightly differently. She talks about the reactions she's gotten from her family, from tourists, from strangers online. And she makes it clear her body is not a spectacle. This digital resistance is powerful. For the first time, Kayan women can tell their own stories without the filter of a tour guide or a documentary crew. They can laugh, question, criticize. They can show that they are not a monolith. Because here's the truth most people don't see. Not all Kayan women agree about the coils. Even within the same family, you'll find different views. One woman may wear them proudly while her daughter declines. A mother may quietly stop adding rings while her sister adds another loop each year. These aren't contradictions. They're part of a living culture, one that breathes, shifts, evolves. Still, the tension runs deep. In some villages, there are unspoken rules. Girls who choose not to wear the rings might be treated differently, less photographed, less included in cultural displays. Families might worry about lost income or social standing, and women who remove their coils after years, sometimes decades, can feel untethered. The body adjusts, but the emotional impact lingers. There's a myth that removing the rings causes the neck to collapse. Yeah, it's not true, medically speaking, but the symbolism is potent. The rings support more than bone. They support identity. And when they're gone, some women feel exposed, not just physically, but socially. This is especially true for older women. Many of them began wearing coils in a time when there was no question. It was simply what you did. Taking them off now feels strange. Not shameful necessarily, but unfamiliar. They worry they won't be recognized, that they'll lose a piece of themselves. And so for some, resistance means holding on, not because they're stuck, but because they've made peace with the tradition on their own terms. But resistance can also mean reinventing the rings entirely. In one community, a group of Kayan artists have begun crafting symbolic coils, not wearable, but sculptural. They create jewelry, metalwork, and mixed media pieces that reference the tradition without reproducing it exactly. Their art speaks to heritage without recreating the physical burden. They've showcased their work in exhibitions across Southeast Asia, challenging the idea that Kayan culture can only be represented by brass rings and woven scarves. Their message is clear: we are more than our coils. Elsewhere, Kayan women are advocating for ethical tourism models, ones that center education rather than spectacle. In these settings, visitors are invited to learn about Kayan history, language, and customs beyond the neck rings. Women speak for themselves, they set the rules, they earn the profits. These spaces are rare, but they're growing, because at the heart of the issue is control. Who controls the narrative? Who controls the image? Who controls the body? For too long, that control has been in the hands of others, tour operators, governments, media outlets. But now, Kayan women are slowly taking it back. They're rewriting the meaning of the rings, not erasing the past, but refusing to be trapped in it. And as they do, they're asking the world to look again, to see not just the coils, but the person behind them. The girl who said no, the woman who said yes, the mother who wears them with pride, the daughter who never will. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper, a pause, a decision made quietly in a village far from the headlines. But make no mistake, every act of choice in the face of expectation is resistance. And the women of the Kayan are full of it. They resist erasure, they resist exploitation, and they resist the idea that they must all believe the same thing, wear the same rings, or follow the same script. They are traditional and modern, reverent and rebellious, visible and unseen. And whether they wear the coils or not, they carry their history with them, in stories, in scars, in strength. The world may still try to reduce them to a symbol, a silhouette, a spectacle. But the truth is more complicated, more beautiful, more human, and that truth, resistant, resilient, and wrapped in brass, deserves to be seen. In the villages where the Kayan people live, where the sun slants down over wooden stilts and the days follow the rhythm of tourists coming and going, the sound of resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet removal of a coil. Sometimes it's a girl saying no before the first ring is ever wrapped. And sometimes it's the act of continuing, wearing the rings not as submission, but as choice. Resistance takes many forms, and in the world of the Kayan neck ring tradition, it doesn't always look the way you'd expect. Let's begin with the women who refuse. Not long ago, wearing the rings was considered a rite of passage. Girls started young, guided by the hands of older women who had carried the same weight before them. The coils represented more than beauty. They were heritage, identity, and pride. But now, as times change and more of the world peers in, a different kind of pride has emerged. A pride in saying, that part of my culture isn't for me. In several Kayan communities, especially among younger generations, fewer girls are choosing to wear the rings. The reasons vary. Some don't want the physical discomfort. Others dislike the attention. And many are simply pushing back against the idea that their identity should be defined by something so external, so performative. Their refusal is, in itself, a form of protest against expectations, against commodification, against the weight of tradition handed down without question. This quiet rebellion isn't always easy. In villages where tourism is the main source of income, the decision not to wear rings can feel like a betrayal of family, of community, of opportunity. Some girls are told they're letting their people down. Others are told they won't find work, or that no one will care about their story without the coils. But still, they persist. They grow up watching the tour buses pull in, watching strangers take photos of their mothers or cousins, and they choose a different path. Not to abandon their culture, but to shape it for themselves. On the other side of the spectrum, there are women who still wear the rings, but not for tradition, not even for tourism, for defiance. These women have seen the way the world looks at them, like curiosities, like relics, like living props. And they choose to reclaim that gaze. They wear the rings on their terms, not to perform, but to push back, to say, you don't get to define what this means. For some, the rings have become a symbol of cultural survival. They've endured colonization, war, displacement, and commercialization. The coils are proof that something has lasted, that the Kayan people are still here. In interviews, some women describe their coils as armor, not just against the physical world, but against erasure. When everything else is stripped away, land, language, autonomy, the rings remain. It's not always easy to hold that line, especially when your image is used to sell someone else's story. But some women are flipping the script. Take, for example, the rise of Kayan creators and educators on social media. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok have given them a voice outside the confines of the tourism circuit. They post videos explaining the origins of the rings, correcting myths, sharing personal experiences. One young woman in a video that's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times removes her rings on camera. Not dramatically, not angrily, just honestly. She shows the indentations on her skin, the way her neck sits slightly differently. She talks about the reactions she's gotten from her family, from tourists, from strangers online. And she makes it clear her body is not a spectacle. This digital resistance is powerful. For the first time, Kayan women can tell their own stories without the filter of a tour guide or a documentary crew. They can laugh, question, criticize. They can show that they are not a monolith, because here's the truth most people don't see. Not all Kayan women agree about the coils. Even within the same family, you'll find different views. One woman may wear them proudly while her daughter declines. A mother may quietly stop adding rings while her sister adds another loop each year. These aren't contradictions. They're part of a living culture, one that breathes, shifts, evolves. Still, the tension runs deep. In some villages, there are unspoken rules. Girls who choose not to wear the rings might be treated differently, less photographed, less included in cultural displays. Families might worry about lost income or social standing, and women who remove their coils after years, sometimes decades, can feel untethered. The body adjusts, but the emotional impact lingers. There's a myth that removing the rings causes the neck to collapse. It's not true, medically speaking, but the symbolism is potent. The rings support more than bone. They support identity. And when they're gone, some women feel exposed, not just physically, but socially. This is especially true for older women. Many of them began wearing coils in a time when there was no question. It was simply what you did. Taking them off now feels strange. Not shameful, necessarily, but unfamiliar. They worry they won't be recognized, that they'll lose a piece of themselves. And so for some, resistance means holding on, not because they're stuck, but because they've made peace with the tradition on their own terms. But resistance can also mean reinventing the rings entirely. In one community, a group of Kayan artists have begun crafting symbolic coils, not wearable, but sculptural. They create jewelry, metalwork, and mixed media pieces that reference the tradition without reproducing it exactly. Their art speaks to heritage without recreating the physical burden. They've showcased their work in exhibitions across Southeast Asia, challenging the idea that Kayan culture can only be represented by brass rings and woven scarves. Their message is clear: we are more than our coils. Elsewhere, Kayan women are advocating for ethical tourism models, ones that center education rather than spectacle. In these settings, visitors are invited to learn about Kayan history, language, and customs beyond the neck rings. Women speak for themselves. They set the rules. They earn the profits. These spaces are rare, but they're growing, because at the heart of the issue is control. Who controls the narrative? Who controls the image? Who controls the body? For too long, that control has been in the hands of others: tour operators, governments, media outlets. But now, Kayan women are slowly taking it back. They're rewriting the meaning of the rings, not erasing the past, but refusing to be trapped in it. And as they do, they're asking the world to look again, to see not just the coils, but the person behind them. The girl who said no, the woman who said yes, the mother who wears them with pride, the daughter who never will. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a whisper, a pause, a decision made quietly in a village far from the headlines. But make no mistake, every act of choice in the face of expectation is resistance. And the women of the Kayan are full of it. They resist erasure, they resist exploitation, and they resist the idea that they must all believe the same thing, wear the same rings, or follow the same script. They're traditional and modern, reverent and rebellious, visible and unseen. And whether they wear the coils or not, they carry their history with them, in stories, in scars, in strength. The world may still try to reduce them to a symbol, a silhouette, a spectacle. But the truth is more complicated, more beautiful, more human. And that truth, resistant, resilient, and wrapped in brass, deserves to be seen. The rings still shine, tourists still come. And somewhere, a girl is still deciding whether she wants to wear them. But this time, things are different. The final chapter of the long neck story isn't about the past. It's about what comes next, and what's already shifting. Because while brass coils continue to wind around the bodies of some Kayan women, the legacy of the tradition is spiraling outward in new directions. toward education, innovation, identity politics, and digital preservation. And the future, as complex as the past, lies in the hands of the women themselves. Let's begin with a reality the world tends to forget. The Kayan are not static. They are not stuck in time. They are not frozen in bamboo villages, waiting to be photographed. They are adapting, evolving, living in a world that's changing rapidly, and one that is, more than ever, demanding their participation. Technology is part of that story. For much of the 20th century, the image of the Kayan woman was controlled by outsiders, photographers, anthropologists, journalists, and tour companies. She was an object framed and captioned, not a narrator of her own experience. Her story was told in third person. But that's no longer the case. In the past decade, young Kayan women have taken to platforms like Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok, not to reject their heritage, but to define it on their terms. They post photos, share daily life, debunk myths, and speak directly to audiences worldwide. Sometimes they wear rings, sometimes they don't. But always, they speak as individuals, not symbols. One woman vlogs about her experiences growing up in a tourism village and later studying abroad. Another runs a small business, selling Kayan-designed jewelry and textiles, promoting ethical fashion and fair trade. Several use their pages to educate followers on refugee rights and statelessness in Thailand, topics that rarely make it into tourist brochures. This digital shift is subtle but significant. It means control. It means ownership. It means the global image of the long-neck woman is no longer dictated by the tourist's gaze, but by the woman herself. And with that control comes the power to decide what the legacy of the coils will actually be. Because truthfully, fewer girls are choosing to wear them. In many villages today, especially those not directly tied to the tourism economy, the tradition of neck rings is fading. Some families no longer practice it at all. Others leave the decision up to each generation. And while older women may still wear their coils with pride, they also understand that their daughters might not follow. This doesn't mean the culture is dying, it means it's adapting. The Kayan are exploring other ways to express their identity, through language, through food, through art, and perhaps in the future, through memory. Memory, after all, is a powerful thing. Some organizations and Kayan-led initiatives are working to preserve the knowledge behind the tradition, even if the physical practice disappears. They're recording oral histories, digitizing rituals, cataloging materials. They're creating exhibitions that explore the meaning behind the rings, not as relics, but as artifacts of living culture. In this way, the coils may become something new, not worn but remembered, not performed but honored. But while modernity and digital presence offer opportunity, there are still barriers, especially legal ones. Many Kayan in Thailand remain stateless. Despite decades of living within Thai borders, they lack full citizenship, limiting their ability to travel, work, access education, or participate in politics. Efforts to change this have been slow and uneven. Some individuals have received documentation, but entire communities remain in legal limbo. This legal status directly impacts the future of the tradition. Without rights, without freedom of movement or income, many Kayan remain tied to the tourism economy simply because it's the only thing available. Even if they want to explore other futures, the law holds them in place. Statelessness also makes it harder to access education. And without education, there's less mobility, less voice, less change. Still, some are breaking through. A growing number of young Kayan have pursued university degrees, both in Thailand and abroad. Some study cultural preservation. Others work in human rights, anthropology, or international relations. A few have returned to their communities to support others, setting up tutoring centers, language classes, and vocational training. Their presence matters. It shifts the narrative. It reminds the world that the Kayan are more than a look. They are people with minds, ambitions, and plans for the future. And part of that future is protecting what matters most, not just the coils, but the culture behind them. This includes environmental protection. Many Kayan communities live in areas rich in biodiversity, mountains, forests, rivers. But these areas are also increasingly under threat from deforestation, climate change, and land development. As with many indigenous communities globally, the Kayan are witnessing a change in the land itself, a change that threatens not just their way of life, but their sense of place. Some elders speak of plants and animals that no longer appear in the forests. Water levels have shifted. Seasonal patterns are off. And for people whose traditions are tied to the land, this isn't just inconvenient, it's existential. Efforts are underway to involve Kayan communities in environmental conservation. In one village, youth-led groups are documenting changes in local ecosystems. In another, a women's collective is working with NGOs to map ancestral land and advocate for sustainable development that doesn't erase indigenous presence. The long-term survival of Kayan culture, rings or no rings, depends on their ability to remain connected to their land, their language, and their own decision-making power. And that brings us back to the question that has hung over this entire story. What happens when a tradition loses its physical form? What if 50 years from now, no Kayan women wear the rings? What if the brass is set aside, the coils stored in museums, the practice remembered but not lived? Is that death, or is it evolution? For many Kayan, it's not a loss, it's a transformation. The rings, after all, were never the culture. They were an expression of it. The real tradition lies in the stories, the relationships, the values, and as long as those are carried forward, through whatever form, then the legacy lives on. In this imagined future, perhaps the coils still appear, but not on necks. Maybe they're stylized in jewelry or abstracted in sculpture. Maybe they become motifs in art, symbols in films, emblems of resilience. Maybe they show up in poetry or in the curves of a digitally animated character in a film directed by a Kayan woman who once lived in a village behind a fence. The point is, the future doesn't need to mimic the past to honor it. Some critics might mourn the fading of the physical tradition. They might say that culture is being lost, that modernity is wiping away heritage. But that's a shallow view, one that values preservation over participation and appearance over agency. The more meaningful story is the one unfolding now, a culture choosing how it wants to be seen. Women deciding for themselves what it means to be Kayan. A people stepping out of the frame and into their own narrative. And as they do, the world has a choice to make too. It can keep searching for exoticism, for something authentic to capture and post and monetize. Or it can start listening. Listening to the complexity, to the contradictions, to the reality that culture is not a performance, but a process. The rings will always be part of the Kayan story, but they are not the ending. They are a chapter, a symbol, a spiral that points in many directions, backward to ancestry, outward to the world, forward into futures not yet written. And in those futures, the most radical thing may not be wearing the rings, but choosing not to. Not because you were told not to, but because you could. That, in the end, is what true cultural survival looks like. Not obedience, not permanence, but choice. And so, we arrive at the end of the spiral. From sacred rituals in misty highlands, to the refugee camps behind barbed wire, to the marketplace of tourism, where bodies are dressed in brass and sold by the hour, to a new generation choosing how they want to be seen. The story of the Kayan women and their neck rings isn't about a single truth. It's about many truths, some worn with pride, others carried quietly in the muscles and memory of those who chose a different path. It's easy to stare, harder to understand. Because behind every image of a long-necked woman is a life, a childhood, a decision, a moment of resistance or devotion, or simply survival. The rings are heavy, but not just because of the metal. They carry the weight of myth, of exploitation, of choice. They carry the gaze of the world. What we do with that gaze matters. So the next time you see a photo of a long-neck woman, don't just ask, how do they do that? Ask instead, why do they do that? Who chose it? Who didn't? And most importantly, whose story is being told and who gets to tell it? Thanks for listening, and rest well.